Now, as we have seen, exception is a superclass, right? And in that we have a lot of subclasses. Now let's try to understand the entire hierarchy. In fact, we'll not talk about all the classes. Let's try to give you the general idea. And with this idea, you'll understand, okay, what class belongs where and which exceptions are compulsory to handle and which are not. Okay, that's an important point to remember. So on top, we have the object class. Now, why it's on top? Because every class in Java extends object. Even if you don't mention, it's there, right? So let's give the respect to object class. Now, below that, we have one class called Throwable. Now, if you remember, while searching for the class, we have seen exception class extends Throwable. So that's on top. One more trivia here. Most of the names which ends with able are actually interfaces, okay? Runnable, serializable, clonable. But coming to exception, Throwable is also able at the end, but it's a class. Okay, that's the only exception which I have seen till now. Now below this we have two, and okay, that sounds weird because we have only seen exception, right? So we have exception here. And apart from this, we have one more which is called error. Okay. Now, why we have not talked about error yet? We are only talking about exception. The thing is, when we talked about runtime exception, we have mentioned that it is something you can handle. Okay. So exceptions are something which you can and you should handle. Errors you can't. Okay. When the errors hit, it will simply stop the execution. Normally it doesn't happen, but if it happens, you can't do anything with that. Example of this, it can be the thread dead. What if your thread dies? Example of this can be IO error. Something goes wrong with the input output. We have a few more, which is your virtual machine error. It can be one of the example I can give you here is what if you have out of memory. So what if your memory is not there? So how can you handle that? Okay. So this type of errors you can't actually handle. So this is something, it's there. It will not happen, but we cannot handle that even if it happens. What you can handle is exception. Now in exception as well, we have multiple options here. So we have the first one, which is runtime exception. So we have the subclass of exception is runtime exception. And on the other hand, we have a lot of different exceptions here. Example of this could be SQL exception. Example of this could be IO exception and many more, but we are just trying to understand the simple one. So we have these two. We have many more, as I mentioned. Now in runtime exception also, we have a lot of different exceptions here. We have seen most of it. In fact, we have seen arithmetic exception. Then we have array index out of bounds exception, and then we have null pointer exception. Now all this comes under runtime exception. This is null pointer exception. Now the thing is, why you have to remember this thing? Not everything you have to remember, but few of them. See, all the runtime exceptions are actually called unchecked exceptions, and all the other here on this side, they are called checked exception. Now why they are unchecked and checked? Most of the time when you write the line, your compiler will not force you to handle the exception. Okay, it will say, hey, it's your choice to handle the exception. So all the runtime exception, all the classes here, it's your choice if you want to handle them or not. But whenever your compiler sees that there is a line which can raise exception, which is not runtime exception, example, it can raise SQL exception, IO exception. In that case, it will ask you compulsory to handle the exception. If you remember, when we were trying to load the class with the help of class.forName, on the right side of the method we have mentioned, it throws the IO exception, right? So it was forcing you to handle it, okay? Okay, we have not talked about throws yet, but we'll talk about it. So basically, these are all checked and these are all unchecked here. And this is something you should not be worrying about. It will not happen most of the time. And this is something you have to handle by yourself. So I hope this diagram makes some sense. This is the top class, which is there in every Java code. And this is your Throwable, which is a parent class of exception and error. In exception, we have a lot of different exceptions. If you get SQL exception in your code, you have to handle it compulsory. IO exception, compulsion. Apart from this, if you have a runtime exception, it's your choice to handle it or not. But as a good programmer, if you want to keep your client happy, please handle the exceptions.